All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming along and joining us today. I just want to provide some acknowledgement of the of funding for this event, which is supported by the Australian government through funding from the Natural Heritage Trust under the Climate Smart Agriculture Program, and delivered by Hunter Local Land Services, which is a member of the Commonwealth Regional Delivery Partners panel. Um, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Neil Moss from Scibus presenting today, and we're looking at maximising winter pasture production and managing wet paddocks. We also have Peter Beale from Local Land Services, Hunter Local Land Services, that's going to chime in with some good advice along the way as well. Um, we're really keen for for some questions and interaction as we go. So you've got a couple of options there. Rosie's already put some stuff in the chat. I think that's a good option. If that's not your thing, one of the other things you can do is there's a little react button that if you choose that, it gives you a whole heap of different things that you can do there, including raising your hand. So that just allows us to see that you've got a comment that you want to make, and we'll have answer those questions or look to take those sort of comments as we go. Um, Anything else, Neil, from your perspective? Just
No, no,
happy,
no, no, no. That's good.
happy with it as an approach. Um, and it might be practical that we jump back on to mute while Neil starts. Otherwise, that can sort of cause a bit of interference with the with everyone else being able to hear, if that's okay. Um, but with that, I'll hand over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, guys, for joining us. We've only got a small group today, but look, everyone is super welcome to be interactive today. And I think, we've a few people here. If you do have specific questions or tangents that you want to follow that we may be able to entertain, it'd be great to hear from you as you go. I guess really topical at the moment, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time, I guess, setting up our client base and farms that we're lucky enough to work with on is how do we actually get the most out of winter? And winter can be a really daunting prospect on a lot of farms. And I guess we've had some significant challenges, and particularly in coastal areas of the state in the last 3 or 4 years with winters. And every year brings its own challenges. And this one's no different. I think we've had, the talk, I guess, is focused on what we've seen up on the mid-north coast this year because of the fact that we've set it up for the hunter. And I think a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss here today apply, the hunter in the mid-north coast apply, right across the state and to anyone, that is getting into the grazing part of the season. So without any further ado, let's talk a bit about how some of the things that we focus on with maximising winter pasture production. And again, some of the things we've faced up north on the coast, how do we go about managing some of these paddocks that actually get really, really wet? Again, a little quick disclaimer: following presentation, general in nature, not considered advice. And again, we exonerate ourselves from more obvious responsibility because it is a general presentation. In saying that, I'm very happy to answer people's questions. So, what are our session aims today? Well, I guess we want to talk a little bit about how we maximise winter pasture growth. I think it's absolutely critical that we do this. There's some great opportunities in New South Wales, I think, for us to grow a lot of grass in winter. I think this photo sort of captures a lot of that, where we're down in Bega here, and this is a photo from last week on some new pastures that we're starting to graze. And, we've had a really interesting and odd season this year where some of our pasture growth has been significant right up until now. We've got areas where we're still growing kikuyu. So, look, I think there are great opportunities to grow and capture more grass through winter, and it can have a massive economic benefit to farms if we can do that, because this is when our cows are in a much friendlier place with respect to productivity and responses to additional feeding. And and similarly, there are some reasonable sort of milk price and milk sales benefits to us, getting the most out of pasture at the moment. Also got some challenges with importing feed and cost of feed coming on farms at the moment, and I'll work through some stuff a bit later that really does sort of demonstrate the benefit of actually growing grass when we can compared to buying feed, which doesn't preclude us from buying feed when we require it. But it sort of sets the stage when we go back to the old adages. Well, it's easier to grow, to buy hay than to grow grass on the current prices for nitrogen. We'll talk a little bit about this nitrogen issue, and I think it's been a pretty vexed issue in recent months with some of the challenges of fertiliser. We're seeing some stabilisation in the nitrogen pricing, and again, huge variation in pricing across the country, and anything from sort of $1,250 out to nearly $1,800, $2,000 a tonne for urea, depending on where you are in the country, which is problematic in itself. But there is that variation. But it also, we continue to get asked as well, can I afford to be fertilising? And again, we've got some issues with wet farms and wet paddocks, particularly, I guess, east of the highway up in Pete's part of the world, and in some of that lower country. And we'll talk a little bit about some strategies for managing those. So look, just a little bit of a recap on the weather and why we're feeling where we are. If we look at Taree as a central point, you can see here a number of charts that have been taken from Climate, which is a really nice app that you can download basically for free and gives us some really good indications of local and regional weather. And I guess one of the things which we can see here on the first chart on the left is quite early in the season we saw quite a spike in. Let's try and get a pointer. Where's the pointer? Okay. For some reason, we managed to draw something there too. So I'll just Control Z. Don't know how I've got those little drawings on there, but we'll leave them there for the moment. But what you can see here is that when a lot of people were looking at sowing up in the mid-north coast, we actually had quite a spike in temperature early, and that caused a few problems with some of the early pasture establishment this year. Led to a few failed sowings, and it actually scared a lot of people off planting early, which was understandable because we've had a few challenges with early plantings in the north with heat, but also with some activity in the past couple of years from fall armyworm. We can see then that the temperature stabilised closer towards the medium temp, but what's quite interesting is in May and June, that temperature here is tracking well above median. So we've actually had a really, really warm May-June period, which has actually given us some quite explosive growth, particularly now that we've actually had some rain up in the north. And similarly, we're seeing this in other parts of the coast. If you look at the rainfall, we've actually been tracking in a fairly significant rainfall deficit up until mid-May, but since then we've had quite a steep increase in the amount of rain, and it's tracking up much closer towards median now at that Taree weather station. So I guess, a dry start coupled with some heat has led to a few challenges, but the recent rain, I think, has certainly, lifted spirits, and it's got things moving, and to some degrees it's made things a little bit difficult and muddy in some of the coastal areas in particular where drainage hasn't been good. But I think, Pete, and jump in here and comment, I think overall we're going to see a net positive from this because it's given us a recharge to a very dry subsoil, okay, which is going to give us some growth for a number of months there. And importantly, in any of those irrigating areas, we've had significant rain in the headwaters and in those catchments, and that means that those rivers are much more likely to run well into the spring with respect to the irrigation system. One of the things we had 3 or 4 years ago was persistent overcast weather. And although the temperature and moisture was good, we actually had real challenges of growing grass because the actual radiant sunlight was extremely low for a number of months. And again, this year we can see that that rainfall has actually set itself up, that radiant heat has been right on median. So, I think we're certainly not suffering this year from being too overcast for growing. So overall, slow, difficult start, dry middle, interesting that we've had this rain now, which is a little bit in contrast to what some of the longer term forecasting has been saying. But in addition to that, we've had the warmth. So I think some of our pasture conditions going into winter are actually pretty good. So where does this leave us? I think
Sorry, Neil, just as you head into the next session there,
how do I get?
the
Yeah, yep,
the slides that the app pictures that you've just shown there, was there a
yes.
particular, sorry, which particular, is there a particular tool that you use for that?
Yeah, the app is called Climate, Paul.
Yep.
So if we go back one, okay, and if you Google Australian climate, you can put in that, and then once you've got that downloaded on your phone, you can put in whatever weather station you like, and then you can start setting up whatever sort of weather that you actually want to look at for which period. So you can set up your radiation or your rainfall or your average temperatures, from various starting points, and then it compares those. All the traces, for example, the middle one are all the different rainfalls for various years, but the dark blue line through the middle is your median
Yeah.
value. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. Just um, yeah, just wanted to
Is yours
clarify.
on analog, Neil? Because I try to download it from
Mine's on
Apple.
Apple, so yeah, on an iPhone.
It is on iPhone?
Yeah, I've got it on my iPhone. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get rid of. I'm just going to quickly end the show and see if I can get rid of these red lines, Paul, and I'll come back. Just give me a sec. I don't know where they've come from.
No, I think I'm adding them.
Oh,
I tried to expand the page, and all of a sudden I'm getting red marks under my fingers.
excellent.
So I don't know what I've done or how to get rid of them, but
It's pretty magic.
it is.
We'll run with those, Stephen. That can be a valuable addition to the show. It's all right. Nothing like a good red line to help us concentrate. All right, so where are we up to now? Early risk taken. Some of the irrigators are well into grazing season, and many are coming on to second plus rotations. Some of them had early planting problems, as we saw. I think this year, Pete, and again, I'll be interested in your comments up north, but we didn't have as much or any fall armyworm impact in our winter pastures, which is a relief given the devastation they caused probably 3 years ago. People with a drier start or those that held onto kikuyu or a bit concerned about planting, they may be just coming onto new pastures. And again, I think this is a lovely slide that we took a couple of years ago, which really just demonstrated, I guess, that net impact of hesitation or being delayed. Where we've had this patch of grass that was missed when it was initially planted, and then has been resown only about 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks later. And you can just see that massive difference in early pasture production that arises from the delay. So again, the delays can be costly. We will catch up, but it can often lead, and there's always this sort of risk that people need to skirt of going early. But for those that have and have been able to, it's certainly leading to some better conditions, I think, now, right up and down the coast. Again,
one observation, Neil, that because the rain came so late, I think
yes,
there's a lot coming away very all in one go rather than normally we're planting behind the rotation, and so the ryegrass is coming on at different stages, whereas potentially there's some farms that it was all sown and then it's all just come up with the rain, so quite a lot in front of you.
Couldn't agree more, Pete. And we'll come on to some of that with grazing management stuff that we'll talk about a bit later, because it has been a big issue, and particularly the guys that have co-planted with oats, which we generally recommend as a way of growing extra feed. A lot of them have been caught and swamped because we effectively waited for the paddock to be ready before we started grazing. But when one paddock's ready, by the time we get 3 weeks into the rest of it, it's all very, very ready. So yeah, it has been an issue. So again, most of our winter pastures are now in place. Grazing and cutting management is something we need to start thinking about and talking about, and we'll talk a little bit about here. We're going to talk a bit about residual management. I think in this presentation, we're going to talk about the use of nitrogen in a higher price environment, which I think is really, really important. Where legumes fit in, tactical use of supplements, where things like gibberellic acid in, and then how do we manage waterlogging. And again, just out of context, guys, this is a picture of some forage barley that was planted in early March, and this photo was taken about 2.5 weeks ago in the Hunter Valley. So again, where we've been able to get stuff away, we're actually, had some tremendous results, and we've got a number of people actually cutting silage in June this year, which is really, really interesting. Okay, so look, I think it's important, again, when we're talking about growing the most grass in winter, it is actually critical we actually get back to the basics of grass management. Most people are going to be in a ryegrass-based system. So I guess a lot of our conversation is going to focus on that. And although it's been repeated many times over the years, I think there are some basic rules that we can't work away from because they actually work. And again, the classic 3-leaf grass works if you want to grow the most grass and harvest the most grass in most of our production systems. And this is particularly so in winter. If we're following a 3-leaf grazing routine with our ryegrasses, particularly during winter, we will grow the most grass. And critically, this has a really important impact on our winter productivity. It will provide us with the most feed. It'll provide us, obviously, with the most effective fibre and forage when fibre is often short in our rations. When we're talking about moving up to slightly longer rotations in 3-leaf ryegrass, we also start to move into a much higher plane of nitrogen use efficiency. And again, this is critical when we're looking at where we're sitting at the moment with nitrogen prices. There's a vast spectrum in nitrogen use efficiency that we'll talk about later. One of the things that really dictates that is whether or not we're actually giving our thyme grass to grow and to express that nitrogen application. We also see big changes in plant composition as we move towards a 3rd leaf in ryegrass that I'll talk a little bit later, which has a big impact on our cow production, rumen health, and our rumen efficiency. And the other thing which is often neglected, and I'll show you some interesting stuff on this later, is the impact of those longer rotations through winter on root development and plant recovery. So again, just a quick refresher. We know that ryegrass grows from tillers. Okay, we get our first leaf growing. Now, where are we here? Pointer options, last pointer. Okay, that's where our first leaf comes from. This comes from the base of the plant. As the plant grows, it expresses a 2nd leaf, and then the 3rd leaf that comes out of the top. And from the base of each plant, obviously, as it's grows, we get this extension and growth laterally of the plant through the tillering system. And as the plant matures, we get more and more tillers as we go through the winter season. I guess the important stuff when we're talking about leaf stage is understanding this graph here. This is a classic Braham pasture curve that really tells us what's happening with respect to pasture accumulation as the plant grows. Because although the rate of leaf emergence is fairly constant through winter and any time of the year, we're likely to be popping up in the mid-north coastal leaf every probably 10 to 11 days. Peak would be pretty typical, wouldn't it, in your part of the world through winter?
Yeah, up to 16.
Yeah, up to 16, depending on the grass. Okay. But what happens, that first leaf, okay, it only is responsible for about 17% of the accumulated biomass. It takes 10 to 16 days. The second leaf is responsible for about 33% of the accumulated biomass. Okay, again, that takes another 10 to 16 days. The third leaf, okay, which still takes the same time to grow, that 10 to 16 period, accumulates an additional 50% of the biomass in that paddock. So if we're continually on a very short rotation, operating at this 1 to 2 leaf stage, which can happen when people get in a bit of a grazing hole in winter, we're actually at the least efficient point of growth of the plant and accumulating the least biomass per day. And we're missing out on this rapid accumulation phase as we move into the third leaf. Okay? So by extending our rotation out and allowing that third leaf to express itself, and again, where you are, Steve, up on the hill, this is probably particularly important. Okay, by having those longer rotations, not only do we grow more grass, but we also see a lot of other efficiencies occur.
The rotation definitely has to slow down a lot.
Absolutely, mate, it does. And otherwise, we end up in this situation where we're just chasing 1 and 2 leaf grass through the winter, and it's really, really problematic for the cows, the soil, and for your nitrogen use efficiency. So again, one of the really interesting challenges that we have with a lot of farms is actually getting them to set an accurate rotation, and it's something that's relatively simple that appears to be made very complicated all the time. Is, you know, how do I set up a rotation? But really, it's a lot of this is basic mathematics. It really is working out how many hectares we have in the rotation, okay, and then dividing that by the number of days, which is our optimal rotation length. So if we do the maths, we know that leaf emergence rate is 1 every 10 days. We're targeting a 3-leaf ryegrass to get our maximum growth, okay, well, we're all working a 30-day rotation. If we have 60 hectares available, we divide that by 30 days. It means we've got 2 hectares per day. Okay, and it's not much more complicated than that with respect to setting up rotations. Where we have a few challenges will be at the front end of the season as more grass is coming into the rotation. And in that situation, you've got to anticipate that additional grass being part of your rotation in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Okay, if you've got a split planting or split germination. And that can be a little bit more difficult because while today we may have 40 hectares ready, okay, if in 3 weeks we know that we're going to have another 20 come into the system, we actually need to set up our current rotation based on 60 hectares. So what we've got in the rotation now, but what will also enter the rotation within our normal window in 3 weeks' time. And again, this is often where people get caught, where actually the grass getting a bit away from them, which is one of the things, again, you've seen, Pete, recently. I think it's always valuable and it's interesting, even with very experienced farmers, how often you walk onto a farm and you say, well, how many paddocks do you actually have in the rotation now? And how many hectares are we grazing? Okay, because it's constantly changing, but it's very easy to lose track of. Once we've got that rotation set, okay, we can very much use the cows in our observation skills to determine what we need to do with respect to balancing that pasture allocation with supplement. Okay, and I guess if we're finding that we're overgrazing and the cows are looking hungry, the answer when we're trying to maximise the amount of grass grown is not to necessarily increase the amount of grass that we offer. The answer then will be to adjust supplement and make sure that the cows aren't overgrazing. So we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. The flip side to that is cows are leaving a heap of grass on our optimal rotation, then we actually have to work in reverse and say, well, is there feed that we can actually take away from supplement to rebalance those diets to make sure that they are utilising the grass that we're growing? Because particularly at the moment with high input costs, there's not much point growing all this extra grass and not actually utilising it and actually having to come around and mulch that or get rid of it other ways. Okay, and again, we do see that where people get locked into the fact that we feed, this amount in a partial mixed ration every day, and all of a sudden they continue to do that, but at the same time, the grass out in the paddocks, which is often of generally much lower cost and better quality, is not being utilised. Okay. Now, one of the things that we need to just be a bit cautious on in our coastal areas is this challenge with annuals and Italians, and also when we've got oats in the system. Our annual and Italian ryegrasses, particularly on highly fertile farms, can develop a lot more biomass quickly than most of the perennials during the winter months. And when they're highly fertile and well established, quite often we'll get full canopy closure at 2 to 2.5 litres. Okay, and this can occur particularly in areas right up and down the coast, but particularly on paddocks that are highly fertile, and if we've used things like gibberellic acid. And in that situation, if we let those pastures go to full through-leaf, we can actually end up in a situation where we actually start getting pasture wastage and we get canopy closure, which can be particularly problematic, particularly if you've got an understory of clovers and herbs that you want to bring through, okay? So we've got to be a little bit cautious on being absolutely wedded to that 3-leaf rule, okay, because most of that has been designed particularly around perennial ryegrasses. Okay, we actually need to come back probably on these really vigorous annuals and Italians to 2.5 leaves, and this is really important in areas like the mid-north coast where you can see explosive growth like we have here in the photo on the left. If we undergraze, okay, this can have a significant impact on regrowth and later pasture quality. And again, if pasture is over-allocated, we also need to be really mindful of the fact that this can have an impact on components. And one of the things we commonly see when pasture is being over-allocated is very selective grazing starting to occur, where the cows actually take the tops out of the grass only and they don't graze down into the fibrous component. And this can play havoc with things like our butterfat tests through winter and spring. Okay, so Pete, this is the sort of thing that you've been talking about and what we've seen a lot of this year, where people have co-planted with oats. Okay, where all of a sudden the whole farm's ready at once. Okay, and we've had explosive growth, and we end up with these pasture covers that are probably up around 3,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare, and the oats has got away and over the top of the ryegrass and caused a lot of shading and damage. Okay, and again, this is something that we need to work to avoid. And what it probably means is that when we're coming onto large areas of pasture that have been sown and grown in one situation, we actually have to start grazing much earlier than we would otherwise. So rather than waiting for that pasture to be mature when we start a grazing rotation, what we need to do is get into there when that pasture won't pull out of the ground at a much less mature stage. We actually start our rotation much earlier to get across the paddocks, so by the time we get to the end of our first round, the paddocks are looking ready to graze, okay, rather than all being ready when we start to graze. And again, this can be a challenging thing to manage at the front end of the season. One of the things, again, we've had to do in a few paddocks this year, and we've had this in Kangaroo Valley just last week, is that the oats in these paddocks have completely got away. It was starting to choke grass. We actually made a decision to take 15% of the farm out and cut silage on it, okay, to bring the rotation back under control. Now, if pastures do get this long, okay, you can see again that the stems in the oats are quite coarse in this situation. If they get this long when they're grazed the first time, we can have really poor regrowth in the oats as well. And this can actually create a bit of a problem if at the same time we've choked out the ryegrass and the other co-planting. Similarly, if we end up with pastures like this, which are outstanding to look at, and this is again taken down in Bega a few winters ago, okay, where we've had fantastic growth and germination, we can look at this pasture and probably say that this is getting too long as well, okay? But when you actually look at the plant, we're actually being grazed once, and this is only probably what you'd consider a 2-leaf ryegrass, okay? So again, we've got to be a little bit cautious. If we let a 3rd leaf grow on this pasture, and become fully extended, then we'll be looking at covers again that would become very, very difficult to manage. We'll absolutely be choking everything underneath. And we end up again with grazing outcomes that look a little bit like this, where we get pretty poor utilisation of a lot of that grass. So again, Pete, I don't know if you've got any comments on this sort of thing, but and this rotation adjustment. I just think we need to be a little bit cautious on this 3-leaf rule when we see these Italians and annuals doing this sort of thing when they're really souped up at the front end of the year.
Yeah, and I think that's true, Neil. Once they reach that canopy cover, they do slow down. Probably you have to look at it in context of how much nitrogen's gone on. And if you do push too hard, you'll get there, but your nitrogen use efficiencies drop off a bit. But certainly once you get that canopy cover, you're going to get shading and things will slow down.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Neil, I just
go ahead, mate.
Yeah, I just wonder whether it's worth sort of just getting any comments if some of the farmers on the call can sort of tell us what some of their current situations actually look like at the moment. I know you just mentioned Kangaroo Valley. Part of the south coast here is actually having an excellent season. So I don't know whether that applies to you, Stephen.
I'm just looking out the window while I'm talking to you guys, and the grass is still struggling to come out of the ground.
Right.
some of it's well away, but a lot of it's not. We're just too late getting it planted.
Right. Okay. So
But
you're still sort of managing a kind of a long rotation to try and
yeah,
allow it
yeah,
to. Yep.
feeding them a bit heavier on the feed pad as a result of not having the grass at the right stage.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's spot on, Steve, isn't it? You've got to roll with what you've got. But if we've been held up for planting for whatever reason this year, it's
Yeah,
amazing. You get away with sowing up your end of the world on the 1st of March, and you're grazing by Anzac Day. You sow on Anzac Day, you're not grazing until July.
yeah,
So
that's right.
it's it's that where do you jump in and how aggressive do you go earlier? Owen, what are you seeing in your part of the world?
Yeah, we struggled. Like we didn't even get the rain that Gloucester and that had through that February March period.
Yep.
We on a forecast of an inch of rain. We put some seed out in the last week of March, early April, before basically coincide before we went to Sydney show.
Yes.
And we didn't get. Well, we had 2 mil of rain and the seed did nothing.
Yep.
So we had basically no growth until we started to have a few showers through that late April. But yeah, it wasn't until things really started here with that heavy or with 2 weeks of rain started probably 3.5 weeks ago now.
Yep.
Is when things started to grow. We've
So
had
going back
most.
to this slope started pushing up here.
Yeah. And we'd missed. Yeah, there were a number of times where Gloucester and areas around had 80 million storms, and we had 5 or 10
Yes.
throughout the early part of the year. So we've basically effectively had no grass. They've been going to kikuyu paddocks through the sort of summer and early autumn just for a change of scenery and trying to keep chewing paddocks down, but obviously feeding a lot of hay as well.
Yep.
To try and give them something to eat. And then, with that rain that we've had, because it's still warm, I'm still shorts and t-shirt today. Like our kikuyu has actually gone bonkers in a couple of paddocks that we'd planted.
Yep.
So we're getting very close to having to graze them to basically, control that the shading, I guess, of the rye and the oats underneath. We did have a frost about 3 days ago.
Yep.
So that'll slow the kike down a little bit. But yeah, we've just started grazing. We're in our second day now of grazing our stuff that was planted at the start of April.
Yep.
Or late March. So yeah, it's quite different to what it has been in other years, unfortunately, because we've always worked on getting some ground planted in that late March at the latest before Sydney, and then grazing normally around that. If it's not by the end of April, by that early May, and starting with that. So yeah, it's been a challenging year for different to other years in a way with the dry.
Yep. No, absolutely, mate. And this is it. It's been really mosaic. There's other places in your end of the part of the world which have got under rain. Guys up on Combine are they're awash with feed now. Other places it's been a real struggle. So yeah, but that's okay. Let's keep going. Okay. So look, I just wanted to talk about a few of the other things that are really important. We've actually, being able to set up, longer rotations. And again, we've touched on the fact that they need to be probably slightly different on annual and Italians compared to perennials. But I guess some of the interesting stuff that we don't really think about is what's actually happening under the ground as well. I guess this is some really interesting study work that I chased out, where they were looking at actual ryegrass development depending under the ground and the root development based on whether these plants were grazed at 1, 2, or 3 leaves, and it's quite fascinating to see that's what's occurring above the ground is mirrored under the ground as well. And this has got some really interesting implications as we move through the year. And also interesting implications when we're talking about things like nutrient recovery and moving into potentially more moisture stress if we do go into a dry spring. What we can see here is that if there's plants are between the sort of 2 and 3 leaf for their grazing compared to plants that have been continually grazed short, if our paddocks do go into a period of moisture stress, we're going to have much better developed root systems which are more capable of scavenging moisture from a much greater depth. And at the same time, if we're irrigating, okay, it means that these plants are going to be able to function again with irrigation that may go down deeper into the profile and more efficiently as well as we go into the spring. Similarly, if we're talking about scavenging nutrients that have been applied, okay, we can see that these better developed root systems are also going to be much more capable of drawing nutrients from both, in their local pool of the surface layer, but also down deeper into the surface layer where some of our nutrients may have been leached due to earlier weather. So again, some big benefits to slightly longer rotations, not just with grass on top of the ground, but also with what's happening under the ground. Yes, the other thing that becomes very interesting from a nutritionist perspective is that we actually start seeing quite a change in plant composition as well as we move into a slightly more mature plant. One of the first things to highlight, I guess, is what we call this NFC to RDP ratio, which is basically the sugars in the plant in ratio to the what we call the rumen degradable protein, or the rapidly degrading fraction of protein in the feed. And interestingly, when we're at leaf stage 1, we have a relatively low amount of soluble carbohydrates, or this NFC proportion, but a lot of rapidly degrading protein that hasn't actually necessarily, been formed as quite volatile in the rumen. At the same, as we move into the second stage, they move into a sort of a 1-to-1 ratio. And again, as we move into a 3-leaf stage, the actual ratio of carbohydrates compared to that rumen degradable protein is actually at closer to 2-to-1, which is a much more favourable position with respect to digestive function and production of energy and protein for the cow. Similarly, we see changes in the mineral composition. And to summarise these quickly, as we move through a higher leaf stage, the amount of calcium compared to phosphorus increases in the leaf and increases significantly. And this 2-to-1 is a much more favourable place with respect to calcium and phosphorus ratios. And similarly, the proportion of potassium compared to calcium and magnesium also starts to drop. And we know that these really high or really short pastures, the proportion of potassium in those is extremely high, and that predisposes our cows to significantly high risk of things like grass tetany and other metabolic disturbances if the grasses are short. So again, we've got changes that have occurred under the ground, we've got actually changes that are occurring within the plant itself that actually make it a nutritionally superior feed if we go into this 2 to 3 leaf stage. Similarly, if the leaf stage is less than 2, we often find that there's actually not enough fibre in that plant, and that can be below the critical level with stable rumen function. And the other area, which we won't get into too much today, is that the level of pasture fats, particularly the very high CLAs, which can impact and reduce butterfat production, are also much higher in short, underdeveloped grass. Okay, so a lot of stuff here that really starts to explain some of the production issues that we can see, particularly with butterfat production and some of the metabolic problems we may see on very short grass during winter and early spring. All right, so I guess Steve and Owen, as we start to come onto our grasses, the big challenge is, I guess, how do we manage and what do we really try and target with respect to looking at these paddocks and forming that balance of optimising utilisation, but also the potential for regrowth. And I guess one of the things that we talk about continually with our clients is it's what you actually leave in the paddock becomes very, very important, because that's what determines what grows back. And I guess the challenge when feed is short and when we go out is to not overgraze and to look at what is an optimal residual when the cows come out of that paddock. And we would generally target what we call this sort of 4 to 6 centimetre of pasture being retained. Gives us an ideal compromise between pasture being utilised, okay, and the potential for that pasture to respond to nutrients, sunlight, and time, and rapidly regrow. If pasture is limited when we start grazing, this takes very, very careful management. And the challenge we often get to is we put the cows in a paddock of new grass, we don't come back till the next milking, and they've buried it into the ground. This is a process that needs very active management, particularly at the front end of a grazing season, if you're going to grow much grass in winter, because if your cows go in and overgraze that grass on the first rotation, it will greatly impact the grass growth subsequently as we move further into winter. So again, if pasture is limited and we've only got a small amount to start the cows on, it's really important that we limit their time in the paddock because they will generally want to eat new pastures right into the ground. So things that we often avoid, particularly if we've got only one feed a day, is actually, going into these paddocks at night time. Because at night time, there is really no way to get those cows out of the paddock. We try and restrict our early grazing when we've only got one feed a day to our day shift. Okay, because at least then if we feel that the cows are overgrazing, we can actually pull those cows out of the paddock and bring them back into a sacrifice area or a retreat where they may be able to get access to hay or a partial mixed ration. The way that it's often best managed at either daytime is we actually pre-fill the cows up with some hay or some partial mixed ration, depending on your system. And this will probably work for both of you. Owen, you've got the hay racks there as you come out of the dairy, instead you've got the mix. As we're coming onto our first feed, we like to probably try and fill out those cows in the mornings on the hay racks, okay, or on a partial mixed ration, and then probably take them down to the paddock at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning for that limited bit of pasture, effectively what I call morning tea. Okay, because we know that those cows are probably going to come out of the paddock at probably between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They're already reasonably full before they get there. Okay, and they're much less likely to overgraze if we've got a tight timing of when these cows are pulled out of the paddock. The other thing that's important that if pasture is limited and we only have a small strip available and it's not enough to fully feed the cows, where possible, we should try and bring the cows there as a group together. Because what we know that if a herd is just let out of the dairy onto a limited strip, those cows that arrive first will graze 50, 60, 70% of the pasture before the other cows even arise. We can see a huge maldistribution in how much feed these animals get. Those cows that get there late are effectively going to be left with no grass at all. So again, as we come on to early pastures at the front end of the year, we're often better off filling them up on a bit of hay straight after the dairy or partial mixed ration, and then take them down as a group so all those cows can actually get access to the pasture at the beginning of in mid-morning before afternoon milking. Does that sort of make sense, Steve and Alan?
Yeah. The timing of getting the cows on the pasture is probably a bit more of an issue than time of getting them on is more of an issue than getting them off, I think.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. And again, look, the nice thing, in colder areas, if you do take them down mid-morning and you've been able to fill them on the pad or on the racks, they're actually often looking for another feed at that time of the day. But you've also had, 4 or 5 hours of sunlight on that grass as well. And if you've had a bit of a frost up top, that's probably, had time to thaw a little bit, Steve. And
yeah, some of these mornings are getting a bit cool.
They are.
The fingers are starting to tingle.
They do, and our plants also had a bit of time to photosynthesize for 4 or 5 hours and can accumulate more sugars than when they're put out there first thing in the morning on a frosty paddock as well. Yeah. Oh, and that sort of works with your sort of system too, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, since working with you a couple of years ago, we've basically done that. We haven't really had. There's been ideal times, I guess, but yeah, that's been our process for the last couple of years, really. When certainly managing filling cows before putting them on.
Yep.
We've got the hay racks down because we're grazing those paddocks just past the railway now. So the hay racks are down there, so all the cows are in that area. They can lounge around, and then I put them on just before coming on this, so they're going on about 11:20, and then getting them off again, sort of just after lunch, or just checking before lunch, and then getting them off after lunch before getting kids from school.
Excellent. No, and that works nicely. And I think as we end up seeing more and more grass potentially being left, we can just go either earlier or get to the point where they can start going straight down to the paddocks. So I think, you know, it changes as we move through the year, and hopefully we get a run where we've got, you know, consistent pasture and we can get straight there after milking.
Well, the night feeds are the cows are leaving the dairy, leaving. They've got access to feed on the pad, but they are leaving to the pastures
Yes.
pretty much straight away. They're
Yep.
the older pastures higher on the hill that are not affected by the cold mornings as much.
Yep.
It just there's a fair bit of variation going on at the moment.
No, there would be, Steve, and you know, it's not until we sort of get in the middle of spring that things sort of even out across the farm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, look, I think thinking carefully about residuals is really, really important. I guess these photos start to demonstrate a little bit of sort of ideal sort of management. I think that the use of back fencing through winter and any time is absolutely critical. And again, targeting a residual that's sort of, you know, that sort of height coming up into your hand. So we've still got some pasture left. Is it really going to optimise our potential for regrowth? Again, if we start seeing this sort of thing, we know we've got potential for additional grazing. And I guess if we're watching our pastures, we now know that if we're starting to see this amount of pasture being left, then there are opportunities for us to tune our supplement down. Okay, the flip side is that if we're coming out of paddocks looking like this, it tells us pretty quickly that our cows are hungry. Okay, there are likely to be opportunities to improve their feeding and nutrition, and we're likely to get responses to doing that at this time. At the flip side, we know that if we're eating down this hard in the middle of winter, we are going to have issues with slowing down our potential regrowth, and this is something that we want to avoid. Okay, and again, I like using the mobile phone rule. I think it works really nicely. Okay, if the grass is as long as the phone's standing on its head, you've got a real problem. Okay, if your mobile phone would sit there and it'd be shading the grass, we've got a real problem. Okay, but if your phone's about that height on its side, okay, that's pretty much an ideal size for grazing residuals. All right. So again, if we are running into a bit of a hole, and it probably, you know, I think both of you guys are onto this, but for the benefit of anyone that watches a bit later, there can obviously be value in backing our rotation off and even taking cows off pasture completely to allow for recovery. That requires two things. It requires some feed and feed inventory, but it also requires some facilities to be able to effectively feed cows and minimise waste. I guess one of the things that stood out in our flood studies is that those farms that recovered from both dry times and also the flooding times the fastest were the cows that actually were the farms that had reasonable facilities that allowed us to continue to feed cows well during difficult times. I guess this is something that the industry needs to continue to grapple with and evolve with, where we do run from drought to flood, you know, often within a period of 6 months, then, you know, the ability to be able to feed cows well and to have flexible feeding systems is something we critically need to consider. All right, let's talk a little bit about fertility and maximising winter feed. And I guess if this is the sort of thing we're seeing in winter, and this is a picture from the Jamberoo Valley, not far from where I am, we can clearly see that we're probably not optimising our winter pasture growth. Obviously, it's rained the same amount across that entire paddock and hasn't mysteriously rained on those urine patches. This is very clearly demonstrating that we have issues with nitrogen and potentially other nutrient availability in this paddock. Okay, so I guess nitrogen has been obviously a very controversial topic in both in the medium term here and particularly with some of the extremely high prices that we are seeing for urea. And we are continually facing the question of, you know, should we be fertilising? How much fertiliser should we be using? What do we do to optimise that fertiliser when we're going to use it? And for those that weren't in a position to lock in early nitrogen before the prices went up, it's been a really challenging conversation. And I'm going to take you through shortly some relative pricings on nitrogen and what the feed's worth that's grown from it. I guess, Pete, and again, jump in here because I mean, nitrogen, I know something you're very passionate about up there, but what we've generally found is that urea has been the most cost-effective nitrogen source. It's been harder to get hold of, but we've certainly had access to nitrogen in the form of urea and urea, not sulfate of ammonia type blends as well. And again, they perform a bit differently. They actually can be quite complementary, that urea SOA blend as a nitrogen source.
Hmm.
The agronomic efficiency of nitrogen use is driven by a number of things. And again, one of the things we need to think about when we're talking about the cost is the cost will be the cost, but what we get from it will depend very much on the efficiency of how that nitrogen is utilised. And again, when we look at some of Staines's work from Western Australia a few years ago, they saw a range of nitrogen use efficiency applied at the same time, between 6 and 35 kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen applied. So that's a massive range, and that will be driven by a number of factors. And we obviously want to be up in that 30 zone rather down in the 6 zone, which is problematic, and I'll show you why shortly. So what do we do to drive that? Again, making sure that we're applying the correct rate of nitrogen for the time of year where a plant is able to utilise it. And Pete, I guess your studies have shown that through winter up in your part of the world, that is around that 1 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare per day. Okay?
At least,
At least, yeah. Okay, we want to be at least hitting that. And at times, I think with some of these modern grasses on better fertility, you can probably up closer to 1.5 kilos. Spring, that can move up to potential utilisation rates of exceeding 2. But if we're at least hitting that 1, okay, we're going to be getting at a reasonably high rate of nitrogen use efficiency. And most of that nitrogen, assuming we have the right conditions in the plant and the soil, can actually be utilised by the plant. Making sure we're fertilising the right crops or pastures at the right time of year. So again, fertilising kikuyu with nitrogen in June, okay, is not going to be a highly efficient process. However, our winter grasses, our ryegrass and cereals, prairie grass, etc., are going to be highly responsive. So that's the right time of year to be utilising those fertilisers. Moisture becomes really important as well. We don't want things to be too wet. Similarly, we don't want things to be dry. Okay, the action of nitrogen as it's applied being taken up into the plant actually requires water, and we require water when surface applying nitrogen to actually take that nitrogen down into the soil. Okay, so again, when things are really, really dry, we're not going to get great responses. But similarly, if things get too wet, okay, particularly if pastures are waterlogged, we're going to lose a lot of that nitrogen through denitrification as well. Okay, so again, moist soils important, and yes, we love when we apply nitrogen to be able to have some moisture to take that in. But again, Pete, you may have some comments on this. I find that when we have at least moist soils, okay, moist aerated soils, if we're getting heavy dews at this time of year, we're still getting pretty good responses to nitrogen applied in the absence of rain.
I think the main issue is if there's enough moisture in the soil to grow the plants, you'll get a very good response.
Yep.
And you can always look at the previous grazing. If the plants are turgid and obviously growing well, you graze it, you put it on regardless of rain. There's usually enough soil moisture to take that up and get a good response.
Absolutely. I think we see a lot more losses from people trying to micromanage the perfect weather on nitrogen applications than from those that take a little bit more risk. So timing is really important as well to get the most out of nitrogen. But, and where possible, it's particularly with our winter grass growth, we want to get that nitrogen on the plant as early after grazing, if not immediately before grazing, okay, and into the soil and going through its various cycles for uptake into the plant. So that generally in our system means that we can apply our urea, if we're using urea, at up to 3 or 4 days prior to grazing, and optimally we want to have it on, within 5 days after grazing. And that then allows our plant to have sort of that 18, 25 to nearly 30 days for it actually to respond to the nitrogen being in the soil. So early in the crop cycle, really, really important. Nitrogen isn't everything, so we also need to make sure that our other soil health and nutrients are in balance as well. Okay, our nitrogen responses are optimised if P, K, and S are all present as well. All right, so while we'll continue to get a nitrogen response, if those other nutrients are low, we'll get a much better and efficient nitrogen response if they're in a more optimal space. So continuing to check our other nutrients and soil testing is really, really important. Plant density becomes another issue, and this comes back to how well you've planted your paddocks at the front end. Obviously, if we've got sparse pastures, we're going to get much lower responses to nitrogen applied on a per hectare basis. All right, Paul. So look, this is just some work that we did, looking really at a grid of different nitrogen prices and response rates, and looking at what that cost of additional dry matter is depending on the cost of urea. And I guess this is a really important thing for people to have some confidence with. So what we've got here on the left are different prices for urea: $750, $800, $1,500, $1,700, $1,900, and up to $2,000 a tonne. Okay. Then we can calculate the price per kilogram of nitrogen for in the urea that's applied. We can look at a series of different responses. So 5 kilogram response per kilogram nitrogen, 10, 15, out to the 30. Okay. And then what the mistake a lot of people do is that they don't consider utilisation as part of this equation. If we apply a 75% utilisation quotient to that, okay, we can then actually cost the price of the dry matter consumed in responses to those different rates of nitrogen application. Sorry, those different costs of urea. And I guess what we're hoping, all right, is we can land in this zone here, all right, with these high costs. And again, 15, 1700 is pretty common at the moment. All right, if we're getting these 15, 20, 25, and 30 kilogram of dry matter responses to a kilogram of nitrogen, these prices, okay, for that dry matter consumed are what we're actually going to be looking at. All right, so we're looking here, at $1,500 a tonne, at 15 kilo conversion rate at 75% consumed. That additional dry matter is costing us $290 a tonne. And again, where that then sits moving forward depends on your alternatives. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So is everyone confident with this? Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I think this is there's been a lot of to me, there's been a lot of discussion around this as fertilizer prices have really headed north. I guess, Peter, I'm wondering, from in terms of that response rate at this time of the year, have you got a sense of what you're sort of seeing, kind of right at the moment, or what you would typically see for this sort of temperatures in that mid-coast region?
Yeah, and I think the figures that Neil's working with are well established and is well researched. And certainly at the moment, for most of the area, we've got good soil moisture, and that's the primary determinant.
Yep.
The warm days are helping too, I think. So
yeah, no, I would expect very good responses over most paddocks. The one thing I would say too, Neil, is that there is a vast difference in fertility in paddocks across the farm. So just adopting one size fits all doesn't necessarily fit the bill. Sometimes you do have to go a bit higher, or an effluent paddock obviously doesn't need as much. But no, they're fairly. I mean, 25 and 30 are high, but certainly 15 to 20 is quite achievable.
Yep.
Yeah. I guess that's probably more what I was sort of thinking. That sort of 15 sort of mark. Stephen, do you have and David, a sense of what you'd sort of be achieving response rate wise this sort of time of the year normally?
Well, no, not really. What I'm wondering, when you talk about getting the the balance in the rest of the minerals right. For the plants, should we be putting our starter fertilizers and blends on 3 or 4 days, 5 days prior to sowing to get a better initiation? Putting the nitrogen on is all right, but if it's going on too late, if the soil profile's not right to start with, how far is that setting it back, even with the added nitrogen?
Steve, I think it's a great question. I guess our standard rule of thumb, where possible, and it comes back to practicality, is if we know our soils are lower in some of those macronutrients, we are probably best, particularly phosphorus is low, which could be the issue up in your part of the world on the red soils, is to try and sow with that fertiliser banded fairly close to the seedling. Because what we know of phosphorus is that it only moves about 0.5 centimetre to 1 centimetre in the soil. Okay, it's not highly mobile initially, and you want it to be readily available to the seedling and where the seedling actually is. So I think, banding those fertilisers if we need them, with the seed is probably the most important thing. And again, I haven't got the slides. I've got other slides on other presentations to sort of show this impact of banded versus broadcast. I don't know if we need, huge amounts of this stuff to be active early. I mean, the flips with the big, I guess, challenge to that is probably if we've got major issues with soil pH. Okay, so if you're trying to tackle major issues of soil acidity and pH, trying to make that more friendly, the process of liming and getting effective liming and lime to work can take many, many months. So if you need to lime, you need to be months ahead of that if you're actually going to be sowing responsive crops. We can do some little bits and pieces with things like calciprol in the drill, but it becomes extraordinarily expensive. So I think, getting your macros right is important. If you need phosphorus, which is one of the key limiting ones, particularly on some of the red soils and some of the other country where peat works, having that banded with the seed is the best. I like to have a bit of sulphur in there as well because I think we get a better nitrogen response if the sulphur's there present as well. Things like potassium, look, they probably become more of an issue for plant health as we go into the dry part of the year. Okay, not necessarily a seedling establishment. But look, if they're really, really low, we probably need to deal with that before planting as well.
I think too, Neil, if we've done soil testing, over a range of dairy farms, and probably 60 to 80% of the phosphorus is adequate to high.
Yeah.
And then similarly with potassium, that my experience, there are roughly 10 to 25% of paddocks really low in potassium, and they tend to be persistent silage paddocks. And I agree with you with sulphur. I think it should be just an annual application, either with your single super or mixing with ammonium sulfate's quite convenient. So
yeah, no, we like that approach. Yeah. A couple of applications of 50-50 urea SOA can be really beneficial as we go along, and it does improve the nitrogen efficiency. So look, and this is just a model, Paul and Pete and guys, which sort of carries through this impact on milk production. I guess if urea is 1,500 a tonne of moderate nitrogen use efficiency at 10 kilos of dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen applied, a kilo of extra dry matter is going to cost us about 32.6 cents, which sort of sounds like a lot when we think about our normal pasture costs. But I guess when we look at a utilisation of 75%, it actually comes back to about 43.5 cents, okay, which is about $434 a tonne dry matter. All right, so I guess the question is that worth it? And I guess that all comes back to a number of questions, a number of other factors. What are you going to do with that grass? If it's actually making up a deficit of grass that you don't have, okay, it's highly likely that's going to be worth it on our current milk price. Most of our marginal milk price for coastal New South Wales is sitting somewhere at the moment between 85 and 95 cents a litre, depending on where you are, who you're supplying, and wherever it might be your milk. Okay, so if we're getting a 1 to 2 litre response, for that extra kilogram of dry matter, which will be the range of responses we get depending on the feeding system, we're looking at somewhere between an 85% to $1.70 return on that kilogram of grass grown or utilised. So in my opinion, that's really, really worth it, because the alternative is thin air, and there's no milk in thin air despite having a really nice view. Okay. If we're looking at alternatives and what we can substitute that with, well, that's a slightly different equation, and we need to think about what those alternatives really are. Okay, so yes, adding nitrogen is not the only answer. Okay, but I think thinking again about nitrogen sufficiency is important. But again, we need to think about, well, what are our alternatives when we're thinking about not putting it on. Now, one of the big mistakes I see with people, comparing grass is they compare grass to buying cereal hay. Okay, and unfortunately, it's not a one-for-one substitution. This is the modelling we did a few years ago for a water project with Bega, and I've just updated some of the feed prices where they were looking at the value of irrigated pastures down there. Okay, and what that pasture cost to irrigate pastures was, because everyone's saying, well, we're not going to bother paying for irrigation, we're just going to buy feed. And I guess this first thing we had to do was say, well, grass is 11.5 ME, 25 to 30% protein. Okay, it's a really, really high quality feed. So we can't just compare it to 9 ME, 8% protein cereal hay. It's not one for one. You're not going to get the same milk response from the two products. So I guess we looked at two ways of comparing that. And the first was let's try and do something with a mix of grains and cereal hay. Okay, and with wheat, canola, cereal hay, and we came up with a compounded ration that was 10.5 ME, about 14% protein. It was hard to get it up a lot higher than that without compromising the energy. And a similar NDF to good quality grass. And when you look at prices, which are pretty typical, $4.20 for wheat, $4.80 for canola and cereal hay on a as-fed basis, you do a conversion back to dry matter to compare them, and then you factor in a bit of wastage for the hay, all right? It ended up that compounded feed was worth about $600 to $4 a tonne dry matter. Okay, so in that situation, do I buy my urea at 10%? At 10 kilograms response rate at $1,500 a tonne, or do I buy feed? Well, I'll probably buy my urea, okay, and keep fertilising the pasture. The other alternative is, well, what's the closest fodder that actually does replicate pasture? And the only one that gets vaguely close is really high quality lucerne hay. And if we're landing lucerne hay on the coast for $5.80, you convert it to dry matter at 644. You put in 15% wastage if you don't have great facilities. To feed that is actually ending up what they eat is about $750 a tonne dry matter. Okay, so it's profoundly more than the cost of grass if you could have grown it. All right. So I think when we start thinking about what these realistic alternatives are by the time you account for dry matter and wastage, okay, and you start looking at that in a milk pricing model, it actually starts saying that, if we're down here, we can achieve anything in this zone, and even stretching it out a little bit in some areas, we're actually still in a pretty good place, still utilising nitrogen. Yes, we'd love it to be $750 a tonne. That would be cool, but it's not. Do we not fertilise when it's $2,000 a tonne? Well, we can contemplate it, but to do it, we need to be focused on nitrogen use efficiency and making sure we get it right. Otherwise, we can end up over here, all right? And that's where buying feed probably is a much better option. Pete, you comfortable with that?
No, I think it's a very good pertinent analysis. Yeah.
Steve and Owen, does this sort of make sense to you guys?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that means if we can't grow the grass, we still buy the feed. We don't walk away from it because, $600 feed and $1 milk, we can still make a margin over feed cost. But if we could grow the grass and utilise it, we should do that first.
Okay. So not all lucerne hay is 10.5 either.
Oh, exactly, Pete. It's good cow hay, right? And a lot of it actually ends up being 9, and the wastage goes up to 25% when it's fed on the ground. So you start putting those numbers in. I mean, that to be a 10.5 ME lucerne hay, it's got to be racehorse quality lucerne hay. So these are important numbers to think about when we're making choices of do we, don't we. If there's a response to be gained, we should probably chase it in our pasture base, but it is finite and it is capped. And if it's too wet or it's too dry, okay, we're not going to get some of those responses with respect to our nitrogen insufficiency. Okay. So where does nitrogen come from? And these are all the things that we need to think about in this pool. And we've got urea, we've got sulfate of ammonia blends, we've got liquid sources, which I think are very useful, okay, particularly during the cooler months of the year. And these can be integrated into spray programs, things like ECN or UAN. And again, there's other high analysis fertilisers, including beans. And it's, again, important to do the numbers on what you're paying per kilogram of nitrogen with what you're buying, because just because it's cheap, okay, per tonne, doesn't mean the nutrient in it is coming to you at a lesser cost than an alternative. We need to think about the speed of release, okay, and also things like volatility. And again, sometimes, Peter, this is where I guess we need a little bit more work on things like the urease inhibitors and some of the coatings. So we'll do the extra $50 or $30 a tonne for these actually pay. And again, it seems to be quite mixed, the research that we see on these things. I don't know if you've got any other comments to add to that.
I think the urease inhibitors through winter are unlikely to be economic. There is some evidence, from work at QET that the nitrification inhibitor might has some potential benefits for ryegrass, but still not clear that that's universal.
We wouldn't disagree.
Yeah.
I guess the manures need to have careful consideration. This is actually a photo I took in the Arctic Circle in Finland. I think it's probably one of the most northern dairies in the world, where we drove past, and they're actually out spreading manures on their crop as they were coming into their very short summer. But the nice thing about their short summer is that they get 23 hours of sunlight, so they can get quite incredible growth in a very, very short time. But look, I think smart use of manures of effluent is something that we need to be doing on more and more farms. And we need to be thinking about this in a number of ways. Firstly, how can we distribute it effectively and cost effectively across our dairy platform? Because as Pete alluded to before, we are seeing concentration of nutrients in some areas beyond what's required, and significant mining of nutrients in other parts of the farm. And again, good soil testing protocols that differentiate nutrient profiles across property is really important. And it allows us then to potentially direct things like manures into those areas which we know are not necessarily accumulating those nutrients naturally. We also need to be quite conscious of what nitrogen contribution these manures can be actually having, because it can be very, very significant, particularly early in the season. And it does allow us to reduce nitrogen, but it also means that it's not hard to actually overdo it on some of these very hot paddocks. And again, we've had a couple of issues this year where we've had significant pasture scald in paddocks which have got a heavy manure history, but have also been treated with starter fertiliser and additional urea, and it's actually vastly beyond what's required with respect to nitrogen application. So we need to be very mindful of how we can use these manures smarter. I've got one particular farm in the Shoalhaven where we've got very high legume inclusion in the pastures. It's about a 30% shafting in the planting. I'll show you some photos from that farm. Sure, interestingly on that farm, we've actually got away from nitrogen, exogenous nitrogen altogether, and basically running that on manures alone and getting some quite extraordinary results.
Hey, Neil, just letting you know we're about 10 minutes away, yeah?
No worries, mate. We'll get through this. So again, thinking about some of these other sources of nitrogen are really, really important. And again, looking at some of the bacterial and soil and plant inoculants which are starting to creep into the market and getting more prominence, perhaps with not quite as much data as we'd like, is something we need to think about. Also, where do legumes fit in as we move forward? We'll talk quickly about that shortly. One of the things that we've seen a lot of is some people getting absolutely barbecued on product which is questionable. This is a client of mine that got cornered in the southern part of the state, needing a starter fertiliser. They were sold this product at $6,000 ton it worked out. I mean, firstly, they bought it by the bag, which was 3,727, but then they realised it was a 600 kilogram bag, so it actually ended up being $6,000 a ton. And yes, it was microgranules, and there were a smidgen of trace minerals in there, but at the end of the day, it was an NPKs of 101704.4. Okay. And look, the bag said you could sow it at 20 kilos to the hectare for your starter fertiliser, but that delivered a whopping 2 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, 3.4 of phosphorus, and 0.088 kilograms per hectare of sulphur. Okay, so an absolute barbecuing on this. And we've seen a few of these sneak in as people have become a little bit desperate. And interestingly, as some of the resellers have tried to ship some product that's been clearly sitting on the shelf for quite a while, this stuff was manufactured at the end of 2024. So look, just be beware, be wary, I think, of some of these things that are being sold, and make sure you just go back and do the numbers. What's the kilogram of nitrogen worth? Okay, whatever product we buy. This would not have represented great value. These are some of the other things that I think we're starting to see more of, some of the bacterial type inoculants and plants. Twin N's been around for a long time. A lot of mixed data on it, really, and not strong. Nutritia is another one that's come out of Corteva, and again, it's meant to supply a bacteria that's absorbed by the leaf of the plant, that's meant to allow to convert nitrogen into ammonia and allowed to be used by the plant. I guess what we're seeing with a lot of these things is a lack of good data on pasture and what sort of pasture responses are out there. And it's difficult to recommend them broadly because we're just not seeing a lot of really, really good evidence. And I guess, Pete, this is some of the areas I think where there may be some really, really good stuff, but we just need to start looking at it a bit more objectively as an industry. And again, making sure when people come up the driveway with these that we ask for evidence, and evidence is not testimonials, evidence is controlled data. And again, if you do trial them, and I'd encourage people to do so, make sure you run untreated control strips. Okay, so you can actually see if this stuff is doing it. If you can see a visible difference, there's probably at least a 10% response. Okay, legumes, all right. And again, this is some of the legume-friendly pasture. I think legumes have got a lot more potential than what we're probably giving them credit for, and a lot of our systems haven't favoured good legume growth or legume production in mixed pasture swards. I guess it's critical if we're going to start looking at the role of legumes, and we've got two very different pasture systems here. We've got a perennial system on the bottom, which is very strongly white clover dominant. At the top, we've got an annual pasture there, which is very much shaftbull dominant, and that's one of those ones from the Shoalhaven that we're talking about. And I'm sure Pete saw lots of these in his days in the Riverina. Okay, I guess if we're using a legume and we're sowing it with our grass, we need to understand, what we're actually trying to achieve. Right? Throwing in a little bit of white clover in an annual ryegrass mix, hoping to see something from it, is pretty optimistic. White clover, when you sow it in 2 or 3 kilos per hectare with annual clovers, you're unlikely to see anything out of that if it survives until the following summer. Okay, if you want action from clovers at the front end and want them to be part of the sward in the first winter and spring, you need to probably be looking at high planting rates, which is up to 30% of the mix of these annual clovers, such as shaftbull and Persian type clovers. And again, they're not suitable for all soil, so you need a bit of agronomic support when you're looking at what legumes you're going to use. But if you get them right, they can be incredibly productive, incredibly nutritious. They've got some interesting attributes. Some of the things that survived some of the flooding last year on some of our clients wasn't the ryegrass and the oats, it was actually the shaftbull and the balansa clovers part of those swards, because they are actually quite waterlogging tolerant. And when appropriately inoculated and grown, they've actually got a very, very low nitrogen requirement. Okay, so thinking about how do we integrate more of these legumes into our pastures as we move forward is important. I guess legume friendly, what do we need to be legume friendly? We need the right macros in place as well. So they do need a good PK and S profile. The micros become important. Things like molybdenum, copper, and boron are all important in rhizobial function. One of the things that is only just getting better understanding is that the rhizobia actually need to be at a slightly higher pH to survive and function than the plants. So we can say that white clover is quite happy at a pH of 5.2, all right, in calcium chloride, but the rhizobia actually needs to be 0.3 to 0.5 higher than that for it to be happy. So we actually need a higher pH for rhizobia for most of these legumes than we actually do for the plants. So that's something that's quite important. One of the reasons why we don't see as good a legume function and nitrogen fixation as we otherwise would, because a lot of our soils are a bit too acidic for the rhizobia to work well. Previous herbicides can also be an issue. Okay, so again, with respect to our grazing management, the other thing that's really important is that we avoid that canopy closure through winter that we saw earlier. All right, nitrogen getting wrong. If you are seeing these patches, okay, this is something to really watch out for. This is urine scald. Okay, and this is again where we've overdone the nitrogen or the rotation is too short. And again, it indicates that there's a significant imbalance in what we're doing. Okay, so if you're getting these dead patches of pasture, we need to really look at how our nitrogen is being applied. Okay, can't go through a winter presentation without talking a little bit about gibberellic acid. We are very convinced of its merits and its use, and right up into the mid-north coast. It's applied to plants. It's a plant hormone that's naturally secreted by the plant in the spring to promote cellular elongation. I guess these are a couple of photos that I've actually taken of it being used. This is actually down in Bega, but we've seen similar responses up north. On the left, on the top photo, is nitrogen only. On the right is nitrogen and gibberellic acid in the middle of winter. The one on the bottom photo is a combination of gibberellic acid and Easy N compared to where they missed with the boom spray on the right-hand side. And again, this is why I like to encourage clients to leave a test strip, right? So we can have some visual support for the fact that we are getting responses. But look, I think smart use of gibberellic acid from probably the middle of May down south to probably early June up north, out to sort of early August only, up north, and mid-August down south around Bega, will lead to significant improvements in pasture production. And the responses that we've measured and are widely reported are between 300 to 600 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per application. Okay, a lot of stuff's been said about the grass quality, and again, to cut a long story short, the stories about it just being watery and low energy, low protein have not been supported when the research has been probably done and these feeds have been tested. Okay, keeping an eye out for critters, very, very important again, and this will vary by region. We've certainly seen things like earth mites in the areas around Gloucester and up on Comboyne at times. Pete, you'll have had other issues with different bugs and critters early in the season. And again, it's important that people are looking at their pastures frequently and considering action when they're seeing impact of pests. Okay, I won't go into detail on that, but pests can have a very significant impact. Weed control, absolutely critical. Paul, we've got 2 more slides. We may go 2 or 3 minutes over time. Basically, that will impact of waterlogging and flooding. And this is probably pertinent to people that are experiencing these. Certainly has been an issue in the past at Owens, but less so now. Occasionally an issue for Steve, but certainly an issue on the east. Okay, waterlogging has been a major problem again this year in areas around Kempsey and probably east and around the islands down where you are, Pete. Basically, when we get excessive water in the root zone, we get anaerobic conditions. Plants need oxygen around the roots to respire and to be healthy. Once that water fills up, once the spaces fill up with water, we lose oxygen, and we get a whole bunch of toxins build up in the soil. This is toxic to the roots. Okay. In addition to this, when we get waterlogged, the soil starts to collapse, our clays disperse. Okay, and again, we lose a lot of our soil structure. Okay, and this can be really problematic for those soils to come back into production, depending on the extent and duration of the waterlogging. At the moment, I think a lot of that waterlogging is still seeping into the deeper subsoil because it was dry. We also lose a lot of nitrogen during these waterlogging events, and occasionally we lose the odd land cruiser in the mud as well. But again, the nitrogen loss either through leaching and denitrification, which is loss of nitrous oxide to the air. So again, these pastures will be greatly nitrogen depleted if they're coming out of a waterlogging event. In addition to this, legume function is decreased, and our root tip death limits uptake of nutrients, particularly nitrogen. We can also get sulfur, phosphorus, and potassium traces as well. Okay, so one of the key goals once we start drying out is to try and restore some of these nutrients so they're back at a functional level. Just waiting for nature at times isn't going to cut it for what we need in dairy. So with respect to the grazing management of these pastures, okay, I guess there's some really good summary data to support you on this coming out of some of the materials released from Dairy Australia. I would recommend people watching and go and refer to those. But again, just being careful with how cows are put onto paddocks, and I guess targeting longest grafted paddocks is always beneficial rather than short grass. We will tend to get less damage in that situation. Increasing the area being allocated is certainly one strategy that we can use. And while cows will leave a lot of grass in that situation, we find that opening up the paddocks a bit rather than tightening it up will generally lead to less damage and paddocks that are marginally waterlogged. Use of on-off grazing can be very useful as well. Okay, because cows will consume between 70 and 90% of their potential intake within 2 to 4 hours of being in the paddock. So rather than leaving them there all day to cause damage, if we want to minimise the damage and there is grass available, putting the cows in for between 2 and 4 hours and then bringing them into a sacrifice area, some other stand-up area can certainly be a viable strategy. With respect to restoring fertility, okay, it's important. Owen, you might recognise this video. To wait till aeration has improved. There's no point putting fertiliser on if the soils are still running water. Okay. Trafficability can be a different issue. And again, I think we're seeing with drone technology some really interesting options with respect to getting onto paddocks a bit quicker after heavy rainfall. And so we're using a lot of these on the mid-north coast for both seed and fertiliser, but also some of our sprays, which allows us to consider foliar nutrients and also things like gibberellic acid, or some of these other options such as humates, IBA, and other biologics that may actually assist with root redevelopment. So, summary, maximising winter growth, focus on grazing management, and the basics is actually the key here. Really, really important that we look at our 2.5 to 3 leaf ryegrass rotations to get the most out of what we've got, and then making sure our length is set for that appropriately, and that we're not overgrazing, we're managing our residuals appropriately. Fertility is crucial. I think we've seen nitrogen as a tool, but it needs to be used skillfully and cost effectively to get the best value out of it, because nitrogen use efficiency becomes a much more important issue than the price of nitrogen. Pasture composition can make a difference. Plenty of legumes. If we've got legume-friendly pastures, that's certainly one of our options to reduce our exposure to nitrogen, but you have to farm specifically and manage agronomically for those legumes to be a significant part of your pasture. Pastures are part of a feed system, and they need to be considered in combination with complementary and supplementary strategies. Some of our treatments like gibberellic acid certainly work in winter if applied correctly, and there may be other cost-effective treatments available. Be aware of snake oil with limited data and science behind them. Waterlogged soils will continue to require careful management. 3 minutes over, Paul, I apologise.
Just in comments on the waterlogging, Neil, a friend of mine at Deniliquin had some compared varietal differences, in wheat.
Yep.
And in one particular trial, there was very little difference. But he also measured the oxygen content in the soil. And
yes,
in that case, it was wet, but it dried out and got oxygen. The other, where he got significant damage, just low oxygen content in the soil over extended periods. So,
yeah,
and that it really knocks things around. Really,
it really does. But I know there's been quite a bit of selection in barley now for more waterlogging varieties. So they are more waterlogging tolerant varieties. But again, you get to a point where it's just wet for too long and nothing's really going to cut it. So,
No.
yeah.
Some locations on the farm with, well-drained soils, even though it's had lots of rain, will drain and get oxygen back. Other parts will be just sitting there and it's anoxic.
So
And
look,
you
I think
won't get good responses.
Yeah, and it's been interesting watching the work that Ben Clark's done up in his place with the laser leveling, just
Yeah,
to see that impact of improving drainage and looking at the cost of doing that compared to buying more land. It's profoundly increased productivity and the workability of those waterlogging prone paddocks, and that's something that I think we need to be, looking a bit more at.
yeah.
Stephen Arwen, have you guys got any questions?
No, it's all good, thanks.
No worries. Would we still got you there, mate? Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for your time again today.
No, pleasure, mate.
There's a question in the chat, Neil, about the clover that you suggested, which I think was shaftal or
Okay.
Persian.
I can't see that. Pete, what's the question?
It's hoping that Neil would repeat the name of suggested clover to plant to establish legume started with S. So.
Okay. So when we're looking at these annual plantings in the in the autumn, we tend to be using what most commonly Persian clovers for dairy systems. Okay, and there's varieties like shaftal, laser, and a bunch of other Persian type clovers. We want annual Persian clovers are probably the pick for dairy systems. Others that are available that may fit in some systems include balancer clover and crimson clover. Okay, two other common annuals, and arrowleaf to a lesser extent, but it's probably not as winter active as we need, if we're looking for winter feed. And look, the inclusion rates in these sort of mixes can be between 8 and 15 kilos per hectare, but we back the ryegrass off proportionately. So mix that you're looking at there, that might be like 13 to 14 kilos of shaftal in combination with 13 to 14 kilos of ryegrass in that mix. It's a pretty aggressive shaftal mix.
So shaftal and Persian are the same.
Shaftal and Persian sort of interchangeable,
Yeah.
The perennial clovers, we tend to stick to the reds and whites, depending on where we're at. And again, there's a lot of work being done in white cultivar, white clover development to increase summer growth, but also to increase stem length. Okay, so those plants are more competitive and they can send their leaf up higher with ryegrass, so they're more capable of actually surviving in mixed pastures with ryegrass. I guess the things you're looking for with white clovers when you're going through the brochures are higher levels of summer activity, highly stoloniferous, which means that they will continue to colonise laterally and fill spaces, but we also want longer stems and big leaf that actually will come up in our mixed pastures more effectively in our dairy systems.
Right. Any other questions? Excellent. I think that's yep.
Well, sorry, Raz and Dave, I didn't realise we had you guys there. Yeah.
No worries, Rosie. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for attending. Thanks, Neil, for running us through that. I hadn't seen a discussion around the content. Is there we'll have the recording. I'm just wondering, Neil, is there anything happening with the slides at all, or is it viewed via the recording?
I think it's viewed by the recording. I've made no plans, but I'm happy for the recording and the slides, if that's been recorded, to be available through whatever networks. And again, Pete, if there's snippets that you want to cut out and package up, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think there's some opportunity for good shorts in there.
Yeah, I think, look, those discussions around nitrogen efficiency and alternatives and how we actually value nitrogen in our systems are really, really important, because it's very easy to get caught, and I won't use in the hype and the hysteria around those costs and say we can't afford to do this. And yes, it's nowhere near as comfortable as when it was $800 a ton, $750 a ton. But actually look at the numbers and decompose those objectively, we probably can afford to do it. If it's the caveat being that you don't have a viable, cheaper alternative, or you are using, practices that give you high nitrogen use efficiency.
Great. All right. Look, I think with that we might call it a wrap. Thank you all for joining. Thanks Neil and Pete for the presentation, and hopefully it's a good season for everybody.
12 months of good weather.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
Cheers.
Thanks, all.